He is fantastic. And another guest that I love deeply in a political sense and in a commentary sense, no shady business in this case, Mark Sleboda, international relations security analyst. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay?
Tomorrow, I am wounded to the quick. Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry,
An honor
Mark.
and a pleasure to be on the show.
It is always an honor and a pleasure to have you, Mark. Mark, there is. Oh, by the way, you guys can find Mark on Boosty on Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda, or you could just put in his name. He will come up. That's Boosty. I want to make sure that you understand to get the pronunciation correct. Mark, let's start on the military part first, before moving on to another topic. Petrovsk, Kupiansk. There's fighting in, I think this is called Drovanovka and Servisk. Russia seems to be moving on offense in this case. And
Seversk.
the fact, Seversk, right. And the fact that there's fighting in Seversk, this was something I think that Gerasimov has said at one point. People weren't able to nail this down, but apparently this is definitely true at this point.
Yeah, almost a month ago already. He said it. Definitely 3 weeks ago, and they were already within what could be considered the city limits of Seversk at that time, and of course they've only progressed since then. And these are Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, and Seversk. There's fighting all within the city limits, and all are really set to fall. Right. There's no question that the cities will be taken. The Kiev regime is still trying to hold them. In Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, there are Kiev regime units that are at this point encircled. That they have no way to get resupply, to get wounded out, to escape themselves, at least not without suffering egregious casualties in the attempt, which of course has happened multiple times before. Of course, Zelensky-Sersky will never order their retreat or surrender, because that they never have, and they never will in this conflict. So if these troops do attempt to flee, then that's on them. And the encircled troops at this point are several hundred in both locations. I mean, it's not a massive amount, but it is enough that loss of those that are, and there are more troops in those locations that are in extreme jeopardy, extreme crisis, that are not yet fully encircled, because Russia is separating different as they move through the city. They're isolating pockets of defense as they move forward. So it's both of those are a foregone conclusion. It may yet take a number of weeks to mop up the situations. And in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, the Kiev regime held on to, fragments so that they could claim that the cities were not yet taken on the outskirts for months and months. If you'll remember, I don't know. I don't think that'll necessarily be the same situation here, because at this point, particularly around Pokrovsk, the Russian forces have advanced so far to the north. And in the area around Pokrovsk, moving from south to north, that Pokrovsk is so generally isolated from the remainder of Kiev regime held territory and South Donbass at this point that it will be very hard to pull that. There's a number of other places also important, though, where Russian forces are also fighting within city limits of important settlements, and that is Konstantinovka, a bit further to the north from Pokrovsk, and also Liman, which is it's just slightly south of Kupiansk. It is north of that last Kiev regime defensive line, right, that we've been talking about for more than a year now, and it's Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. And Russian forces are already moving into the outskirts of Konstantinovka in the south. In the north, Russian forces, once they take Liman and then Izium after that, they'll be able to move on Seversk from the north and from multiple directions, which means it will fall, of course, much easier and much sooner, because it won't be, defended to that position. That's why Izium which is very close to Le Mans, is often considered the gateway to Slavyansk, right? The way
Mhm.
it's talked about in the military circles. So all of these, I mean, Russia's not just advancing on one settlement, right? It's not the Battle of Bakhmut. It's not even the battle the way Avdiivka was, already, a year plus in the past. What we're looking at is Russia now advancing all along the contact line. And in other places along the contact line, Russia is also making big advances simply because the Kiev regime is forced to transfer manpower from other locations to try to vainly to hold on to these, more urban, important areas in the Donbass. And that is particularly in the south, in Zaporozhye, and in Dnipropetrovsk, right? Russian forces are just, there's nothing to stop them really at this point. They're inhibited more by their own logistics and the need to fully secure territory behind them at this point, but they haven't met any really significant resistance. And the Russian forces are already moving on Gulai Polya and the Rehov in Zaporozhye region. And likewise on the small settlements in the area in Dnipropetrovsk. Which is interesting because, of course, these are not part of the four regions of, Dnipropetrovsk is not part of the four regions plus Crimea of the Ukraine that Russia has claimed as their own. Moving into Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov in the north, Dnipropetrovsk in the south. These are two new regions, of course. And then you could also talk about the Russians' still relatively small incursion along the contact line in Sumy. So everywhere Russia is advancing, they made a big deal about Kiev regime counteroffensives in the Pokrovsk area to try to stop the Russian breakthrough north of Pokrovsk. For the last 2 months, really. And they made an attempt, and they played up their attempt to the media and to the Western elite, exaggerating it out of all proportion and success. And its day has passed. I mean, there is a tide of war, right? There is a lull and, an ebb and a flow. Always there is an attack, an advance, and a counterattack. I mean, that is but their ability to counterattack is now just fading. They just don't have it. They don't have it anymore, and they've wasted some of their best remaining units, right, pulled from other locations to try to make these counterattacks, and they bought them some time. That is all that they did. They bought a limited amount of time, but those forces are already exhausted, and Russia is once again advancing in all those areas north of Pokrovsk, and the counterattack is like so much smoke in the wind, right? It's gone. Part of the Kiev regimes and their babysitter, former General Kellogg's attempts to sway Trump with this Ukraine is winning nonsense involve these counterattacks in the Pokrovsk area, and already we're looking at less than a month, and those claims are quite obviously false, and were always false, and that's the situation. And as much as the ground war is continuing on, and everything is in Russia's, they still have the initiative. They still have, there is no let down in the offensive. It is always ever increasing at this point, right? And we're still in the attrition war, right? So that style, right? That slow advances that focus more on destroying the enemy formations than the focus is specifically on conquering territory. That is still mostly incidental. But the era of the war of attrition in the skies also continues. with drones and missiles. A large part of it is now targeting each other's infrastructure. And once again, Russia has the huge advantage here. But we now know through reports, I believe in the Financial Times, that the U.S. Has been actively aiding and even directing the Kiev regime's attacks on energy infrastructure in Russia. And this is, they're obviously fully behind this. And this, while they're making the pretense of being some neutral mediator and arbiter, Trump trying to bring a settlement to the war, which is why Russia's not taking his entreaties, at face value. I don't want to say very seriously, because that's not necessarily true, but it certainly is not taking it at face value.
Really?
But neither are they drawing excessive attention to this, because while Russia has always quietly maintained that ultimately the West assistance was, that these long-range strikes targeting oil refineries and so forth, the softer targets, was not possible without active Western assistance. Now it's not deniable, but it's not Russia that is yelling about this, which is, again, part of, I don't know that there's, it's part of the political game that the Kremlin, or should I say Putin, has chosen to play, where he is still prioritizing the possibility of, however fading, of engagement with Trump over, shall we say, a more confrontational diplomatic position, which frankly, there's starting to be some, grumbling within Russia that this is pointless and actually humiliating, and why are we doing this? So
the Nobel Prize thing was deeply humiliating, where Putin gets out and makes. You don't think so?
You mean the who was selected, or the fact that Trump didn't get it?
And Putin said something like, well, Donald Trump, basically that the Nobel Prize has no value, which he's right about. And then he goes into this notion that, well, they should have given it to Donald Trump, et cetera. And I'm like,
well, he didn't say that. He said that Donald Trump has made significant efforts at settling. And even when he was talking about peace, it wasn't direct. It wasn't that Donald Trump is bringing peace. And it was that Donald Trump has made significant efforts to settle several long-running conflicts, which I guess through a generous interpretations of threats and blackmail, could be interpreted that way. If you want to sow and shows in enforcing a colonial administration on a defeated Hamas in Gaza, I mean, if that's the way you want to term that, I mean, the Russian government has no particular love for Hamas. Let's make that clear. They have a great deal of sympathy for the Palestinian people of Gaza, but the problem, of course, with Hamas is they have no real friends anywhere. Right? I mean, they fought with the jihadists that now rule Syria to overthrow Assad, and of course fought Russia at that time. And now that Al Qaeda, ISIS, Al Julani is in charge of Syria, you don't exactly see him running to Gaza's to Hamas's defense, either rhetorically, politically, or militarily, of course. Which anyway, Hamas is what the Palestinian people of Gaza had, and Hamas has been, crushed. Even if that required, the genocide, an ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people of Gaza to get to that point, which
I'm just pointing
was
out
always
Putin didn't have to even say that.
No, he didn't. He did not. And I turned around and to my wife, and I just rolled my eyes and made snarky comments about Putin's comments, and said we're still playing the game. I don't agree with it myself. But again, it's not always about direct engagement with Trump. It's not even the belief that engagement with Trump, of playing the game with Trump, will necessarily have any success. There are wider diplomatic, shall we say, elements here. And there's a number of other countries in the global south that Russia wants to keep on side.
Oh, I see.
Right. China's a given, right? But when we're talking India, Brazil, Indonesia, these other, the Arab states, there are broader diplomatic considerations, and Russia has kept them, shall we say, either neutral or, as the U.S. terms it, on Russia's side and trading with Russia by effectively claiming the diplomatic moral high ground, right? And that is always, I believe, a top consideration of Putin's, because it has enabled, despite the existential economic war of sanctions and financial levers of control and everything, that was always the first way that the U.S. envisioned crushing Russia, and the way that has been averted to a very large degree is that the rest of the world refused to stop trading with Russia. And indeed, China and India, particularly India, both massively picked up Russian energy when Europe dropped it. Now, part of that is because they needed to, because global commodities, finite supply, shock to the system of redistribution and everything. But of course, the U.S. doesn't quite see these things this way. They are referring to China and India as the biggest culprits of the war now, as they continue to funnel weapons into the Kiev regime. But the hypocrisy is just, well, of course they mean on the other side, right? That's the part that they don't say. But that is always a consideration of Putin's, is maintaining, the diplomatic high ground because of trade and diplomacy issues. And that's not always easy, understandable to someone who is just, say, focusing on the military perspective and saying, why does Trump, or why does Putin continue to try to blow smoke up Trump's posterior and everything like that? Yeah, and it's a little gut churning, right? I'll admit it makes me a little sick to the stomach. I would prefer a bit of honesty in reply every time Trump throws one of his tantrums and goes off. But there's also the fact that President Putin has set a standard for the Russian presidency, I think, right, in the modern era. And that is, he is unfailingly polite and respectful to the leader of every state, no matter what the current state of relations between Russia and that state, which again makes him a statesman, hands and above, pretty much everyone else in the world. But it's not always satisfying to someone who reacts to what the West is doing in Ukraine and beyond, with a bit more of a gut instinct, shall we say. Putin does not react from the gut. Putin reacts from an ice cold Russian intelligence cerebral level.
Do you think that he really believes that some connection between him and Trump was made, like that he was understood in some way, or do you think it's just?
I don't believe that. I believe that he was, to some extent, fooled by Merkel during the Minsk process, because he had a residual Germanophilia from his time in Germany and so forth, right? It's a disease, right? It's not as substantial a disease as Americanophilia. But no offense, Jeremiah. It's like a venereal disease, basically. I don't believe it about Trump. I think that they have a psychological profile of Trump and they're playing a game. I mean, everyone else in the world is also playing that, with one notable exception: China.
Yeah.
China does not play the game of, playing in Trump's court, if you will, right? They don't play the game of blowing smoke up Trump's posterior. Even Putin does that to a certain extent, I believe. China does not. China never has, and they're never going to. But of course, they are in a position when, in many ways, they're more powerful than the United States now, for at least the ways that it matters, other than nuclear weapons.
Right.
And they're making rounds on that one too. And that's what we see right now with the trade war redux that is going on, and China is fully prepared. And replying to the U.S. in kind for every slight and insult, and not trying to assuage Trump's ego or his narcissism or his ever present demand for, his, the narrative always has to be spun in his way, and China doesn't play to that. Right. Putin, for instance, is always careful never to insult Trump, and to always try to give him some opportunity to save face politically, because that is extremely important to Trump, and Russia realizes that, and they're in a much more precarious position, of course, not necessarily because of the possibility of military defeat of Russia on the battlefield, but because there's a very slippery slope of escalation to actual nuclear conflict that they have to keep in mind as well. China, as important as the trade war is, and it is extremely important at a geopolitical level, it's not immediately, there's no immediate possibility of a slippery slope from that alone to nuclear war. Right. I mean, there is a broader context where that could lead to that, but it's not the immediacy, of course, of a physical military conflict. But it's interesting, right? There are two principal, well, you could say now that there are three countries of note, right? I mean, North Korea and Venezuela, I don't really count, as major powers. They're not. But Russia is defying the U.S. militarily. China is defying the U.S. economically, and India is defying the U.S., I don't know, shall we say diplomatically, because they're refusing to accede to its demands. And I guess, we could term it that way. But that is a situation that Trump is satisfied in none of those three locations, of course, but doesn't necessarily have the power to change either one of them, no matter what he does. So that when Putin is in, making these comments about the Nobel Peace Prize, keep that. He did say, I'm not the one to judge whether Trump gets it.
He did.
And then it was, and it's not worth anything. So, why not give it to Trump? That was what I interpreted out of it.
Well,
right?
we did say this thing is no value at this point. What is the point of this prize if you're going to just
credibility, and so why not give it to him, right? That was what I read out of it,
I
right?
just
and
didn't
I
like
still
him
wasn't
going
happy with that
direction
but,
at all. I just was like, why are you doing this? Is not even
you
something
didn't say you literally just bombed Iran after the pretense of diplomatic engagement with them, which is what I would have said. But then again, I don't have the responsibility of a country of 150 million people and a multipolar world order, comprising the rest of the globe at stake. So I have the license to snark and feel contempt for Trump. Putin may not necessarily, have that. I mean, he could, but there would be a cost.
Well, he has meant for that, to be honest.
Yeah, he does. He does have the bad cop. He does have
you mentioned something. You pointed out that Russia is going into regions that are not part of the four regions that they were initially discussing. These are two additional reasons.
Yes.
Three of them. Something. Okay, three.
Oh yeah. I mean,
what is that indicative? Is that indicative of, look, we may give deference to Trump, but we don't really have a belief that this.
Absolutely. I mean, none of Putin's game with Trump diplomatically, I don't believe has had an ounce. I don't like it, right? And I will say that outright. I feel uncomfortable about it. I understand the reason for it. I'm not sure whether that is enough, but I understand it. But
Yeah.
I also see that all of this diplomatic game has not in one iota affected Russia's goals, strategy, or implementation on the battlefield. That has not been affected at all. I do not believe that I've seen any evidence that that has affected that. And obviously, I mean, you could almost argue the opposite. The fact that Russia has gotten no results through that mean that Russia, I think, is already looking well beyond the Donbass. And an interesting note, Putin met with a number of admirals and generals recently in St. Petersburg and spoke to them. And then he took them with him on a personal tour of the tombs of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, two of Russia's most important historical leaders, you know, whatever you may think of them, and who both expanded the Russian Empire more than, you know, anyone since Ivan Grozny, since Ivan the Great, the Terrible, as they call him.
Peter's too highbrow.
Right.
He's too highbrow. Trump is not gonna. He's not gonna get that. They're gonna have to give him a color book. I'm sorry. Continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah. He took them there, and I mean, it's really impossible for me to understand that. I mean, it was Catherine the Great who took southern, you know, what is today southern Ukraine, you know, Crimea, which is already part of Russia, from the Khanate, the Turkic allied Khanate, the Golden Horde that was there, and Peter the Great that took other territory and defeated Charles, the Swedish at Poltava. Which is also in Ukraine in this, great historical battle ending the Great Northern War. I can't see any other reasons for that kind. That was obviously an appeal to Russian history and nationalism and so forth. And, I do believe that Russia, whatever they're playing, another thing that must be said is Putin has also made not one concession to Trump in the goals of the SMO either. So, again, it may cause a little bit of a nausea seeing him, give a certain amount of entirely unwarranted professional respect to Trump, but it hasn't affected Russia's position via, diplomatically via the SMO. It hasn't affected the battlefield at all. So, we should probably grin and bear it.
No, fair enough. I accept it. But does it? Yeah. Well, and I guess there are two questions with that. Yeah. Obviously, he's doing that to get across intention, meaning this is him giving this.
I think it's well beyond that.
Yeah,
I think that's what they've already made the decision. I mean,
does this include
Lukashenko? Yeah, the Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, which of course is in a degree of union state with Russia, once again repeated over the last few days that Ukraine as a state may disappear. Right, and that I'm sure was a mess. That was a message sent, and I think that Russia's already decided that it will disappear. That they've been left with no opportunity. At the very least, a rump state that will all be left. At the very least, Russia, at this point, intends to take everything east of the Dnieper, but will probably go beyond that too. East and south.
Out how they had a choice otherwise, to be honest. I mean, short of getting
they certainly did not want to. I mean, they did not want this, right? They wanted all the way back to 2014. They wanted Donbass as an autonomous region back in Ukraine. Only Crimea. Right? That was it. And everything since they've been forced to take because the West, refuses to except that they're not going to be allowed to absorb Ukraine into, their geopolitical consolidation of the European continent under NATO and U.S.-led Western global hegemony. They flip that territorially, justly, as they see it, with the 2014 Maidan Putsch events, then it's theirs, and they geopolitically marked it, urinated on the territory. And Russia has always, first, they only objected for 8 long years politically, for the most part, right? And then they gave up on that and launched the SMO. And since then, at every point, they've stopped, and then they've offered terms and made clear that the terms would get more territorially expansive every time they had to ask the question. And we're going to see that sometime next year, probably before the middle of the year, sometime in 2026, sometime by the summer, I expect they will have taken Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, and Donbass will be effectively, taken, and they'll turn and they'll say, "Are you done yet?" And think long and hard before you answer, because we're already deep in Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk and elsewhere, right? And they will move then to take Zaporozhye and Kherson City and probably Kharkov. I don't believe that they'll move for a military, storm of any of these cities. I think they now have the abilities, they now have the manpower, and Kiev has such a deficit of manpower and so forth, that they will then be able to invest these cities, right? To put them under effective siege, and they'll take them that way rather than do the damage to them. That would be, they don't want Kharkov to be another Mariupol, right? I mean that is unthinkable, really. But I believe there will be a moment, and it will be a political moment of political crisis in the West as well, because the insistent, outraged, and screaming demand for direct war with Russia will reach a new pitch, right? That will be the crisis moment for the West. And of course, Russia understands that. I think they do. I mean, they'll give the opportunity. Are you done yet? Will you tap out? Will you, whatever, face saving is necessary, but will you admit your loss here? At least, in the terms that we've set forth. And they won't, of course. It's impossible for them to do. Right. And then Russia will be forced to move further, right? And then I don't know if there'll be another such moment, but there will be more crisis moments, right? When Russia takes all of the Donbass, when Russia takes Kharkov, when Russia crosses the Dnieper River in force, when Russia moves on Kiev, right? Those, and then eventually, unless someone comes to their senses, which I really just can't imagine, then into Western Ukraine as well. Every one of those, and this will probably last out several years into the future. But at each one of them, Russia, will, I think, in some form or another, re-offer the question, "Are you done yet?" And they never will be done. They'll never accept these outcomes. So they can't, because their hegemony is something that, to a very large level, is built on narrative and belief. And to have the hegemon defeated in this way and admit to it, they will always hold out for a black swan or turning of events in another way, like they did in Syria. And to be fair, it was successful in Syria, because although Russia and the Syrian government won on the battlefield, they then lost the peace. The West never admitted their defeat there. And yeah, they had to let Al-Qaeda take over Syria, but yeah.
It's slightly different. Like, this is not, Russia was dealing with that indirectly. This is direct. This is,
yeah, it was. Well, no, Russian forces weren't dealing with that indirectly. They were there. Russian forces were fighting in Syria.
Yeah, but the responsibility is different, right? I mean, this is not the same.
The level of geopolitical importance is different. That is true, right? Obviously, Ukraine has greater geopolitical, cultural, historic experience than Syria. But I don't think we should be afraid to say that Syria was a big L for Russia.
Oh, it was. No.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if.
Yeah, you're trying to argue that it's not directly relatable to the situation.
Yeah, right. Like
I would agree with you. There's a whole host of differences, but is that Russia should, and all of us should be extremely cautious because things can be turned on a dime sometimes when you least expect it, in ways that you don't expect it. And I did not expect the Syrian government to collapse in December within the span of 2 years. And I don't think anyone seriously predicted that either.
So everybody who I talked to had this just shocked, radical shock.
Like shocked me. I could see what was happening, but the buyout of the Syrian military as a result of the hollowing out of Syria economically, but I had no idea that it had gotten that bad.
Yeah.
Why? Because I hadn't been in Syria. But I don't know. Even people who were in Syria didn't see that coming. People who were literally in Syria at the time were shocked by the event. So anyway, all I'm saying is that there is no complacency when dealing with the West, and their belief in that they should never accept these results will almost certainly be, in part dictated by their relative success with that, stratagem in Syria. And again, not without, entirely without cause, without justification. That's what they will tell themselves.
Well, the new thing that apparently is going to change the trajectory of the battlefield are the Tomahawk missiles, because, that's the new wonder weapon that is apparently Donald Trump is continuously threatening the Russians with at this point. Do you really believe that this is a legitimate thing? I mean, I saw a picture, I think it was on Sleboda, where they were showing trucks that can launch them from the ground.
Yeah, a new smaller vehicle-based launcher by an American company has obviously been in development, and they're now announcing that it's ready for mass production. We don't know how many of them they already have. I would suspect now that it's been revealed that they probably already have enough to make that transfer. And these systems will be more mobile and something that they can probably provide to the Ukraine. Whereas the much larger and more advanced Typhon system that they have only a couple of, was not really practical. So, it seems they're going to go forward with this, right? We've also seen a follow-up article by the Financial Times say that there's only, of course, a limited number of Tomahawks that can be provided because of the U.S. has so many other commitments in Venezuela, which they intend to launch, obviously, a bunch of them. And, always they need a large reserve for the war with China, as they see it. And I mean, Russian, it's like with everything else. We've seen previous such long-range Wunderwaffen with the Storm Shadows, the Scalps, the Attackams, the ground-launched small-diameter bombs. And at every turn, they've gotten a few licks in. And then Russian air defense and electronic warfare have built up profiles. And then you never hear anything about these weapons again because their success rate drops to very small, and then mostly at soft, relatively undefended targets. That's why you don't hear anything about the Storm Shadow and the Scalp anymore, or the Attack, or anything 8%. Else. I mean, there was this brilliant title over a year ago now in the Western press that Western high-tech weapons work against Russia in Ukraine up until they don't. Right. And then it's that whole, sci-fi geek analogy that I will insist on. That, it's like, firing phasers at the Borg in Star Trek. You got 3 shots, make them count, because after that, the Borg shields have adapted, and then you're done and you're turned into a Borg. right? That's not that I'm saying that Russia is the board, but that it works for the defensive analogy anyway. Now it's the same thing, right? Because the Tomahawk is ultimately GPS guided, and Russia has the ability to block GPS signals, and their air defense systems, the S-400 was to a significant extent designed specifically to bring down the Tomahawk. The Tomahawk was a good weapon for its day, and it's still a pretty good weapon, right? But it was built in the 1980s, and Russia's defenses are much more advanced. And so, as Putin said, they'll get, they'll do some damage, they'll get their licks in, and then, but that will be it. And they don't have enough of them now. What occurred to me just this morning as I was thinking about it, I was like, going into the shall we say, conquer the world gamer civ zero sum total war mindset. What would I do if I were the US and the rest of the West, and in the situation where they see themselves, where their intent now is to force Russia with long range strikes to the negotiation table on their terms, right? That's what they think they can do. That's their strategy now, right? That's what this war against Russia's refineries with drones that has failed to achieve that objective were meant to do. And, so the Tomahawks, they know the Tomahawks are not going to be enough to do that. And Russia knows that the Tomahawks are not going to be enough to do that. And this is Trump's poker bluff, right? He's bluffing. And Putin is perfectly ready to call him on that. What I would do, knowing that the Tomahawks were not going to be enough, knowing that the Taurus provided by Germany in isolation would not be enough, knowing that the storm shadows and the scalps that have been provided to the Kiev regime, okay, let's be honest, that the British have fired into Russia so far.
Right.
I would plan a big missile offensive against Russia using all three at the same time. The Tomahawks, the Taurus, and whatever storm shadows and scalps the UK and France have been able to produce, in the meantime, right? Because they already went through their entire deliverable inventory. Some have doubtless been produced in the last months, right, that they haven't even tried to use. So I would launch a big missile offensive, right, against long-range targets in Russia, refineries, military targets, lots of things all at once. That's what I would do. Now, that would be a very risky play.
That's what I was about to say.
Russia would be almost compelled to respond, and not directly, not only to the Kiev regime on that. I mean, the voices for Oreshnik's landing at German air bases where NATO is planning all of this out and implementing it would be enormous. But I believe that they're willing to go to that, past that red line, to go to that extent, because they're desperate and they can't accept the results, and they will still hope that Putin will not escalate beyond the proxy war. The rules of the proxy war, such as have been established. That's my bet. That suddenly occurred to me today that would be a more effective use, because using all three suddenly in concert, the hope would be that at least temporarily that would, to an extent, overwhelm Russia's air defense and electronic warfare capacity.
Mark, I have to let you go. I agree. Yeah, that's risky. And look, I guess the thing is, Putin has already said, if they fire these missiles, this is you launching these missiles at me. So regardless of whether they can compensate or not, they're still stuck with the fact that Putin has said that.
But that's actually much softer than what Putin threatened before, right, when Biden was launching them.
Yeah.
When he said, we reserve the right to hit you back, not the Kiev regime. That was said. And that is not being said now. And that's why there's actually some disgruntlement in Russia that Putin has shall we say, softened his deterrent rhetoric against Trump, where it was much more direct with Biden.
Mark, you are fantastic. Great breakdown as always. Best in the business. I say it proudly, and I mean it. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Boosty, Boosty. If you put in Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, or just put in Mark Sleboda, he will appear. Definitely check him out. Subscribe to his content. Thank you for this, Mark. You be safe, okay?
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. As I always, best in the business, and I mean it.